It has come to my attention as so many people still struggle in creating 3D animations in Frima. Well, in this video I'm going to be spilling out everything on how top designers do those smooth 3D animation in Frima. And in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to create this 3D animation from scratch. Even if you have not done anything 3D in Frima, this beginner guide will guide you. This beginner tutorial will guide you through everything you need to know about 3D, because we'll be starting from scratch. I will show you guys how to lay out the basic structure that we need to create these 3D animations before we start adding screw transform, sticky screw or screw sections. I mean, it's a whole lot, but if you follow this video step by step, trust me, by the end of this tutorial you'll be able to pull this off yourself. So what are you waiting for? Let's jump right in. To achieve this kind of screw animation in Frima, we have to learn a lot about 3D, screw transform, sticky screw, screw section. It's a whole lot of process, but trust me, I'll be taking everything step by step for you guys to understand. The first step to this is kind of laying a basic structure before we start applying these images and knowing how to set them in a 3D environment to create this kind of interaction. So if you check the link in the description, there's actually going to be a remix link to this design project. So you have the home page where we have the actual design and you have a blank one which is a tutorial aspect. So by the time I finish this recording, the tutorial aspect must have been finished, so it's just for you to come and observe in case if you have missed your step in any way. So the first step to this is actually using stack. We're going to prioritize stack a lot on this animation. So first things first, I'm going to turn this desktop here into a stack. You have two ways you can do that actually. One is through the properties menu by clicking the plus right here, or using the short key Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter on your keyboard. So I'm just going to go over to the properties and select a stack. Next up, I will check the gap and put this down to 0 because I don't want any gap between each sections I'm going to create on this design. Since we have turned this desktop into a stack, we have to bring out another layer inside of it that is going to wrap all the design elements we're going to be introducing in this tutorial. So F on your keyboard, drag out the frame. For the width of this, I'm going to set it to fill width, and for the height, we are going to set it to let's just put 4000 here. I think we're missing 10 and enter. I'll be turning this into a stack, setting the gap right here to 0, and also I'll be setting the distribute to start. So all the design element that is going to fall into this section will start from the top of the section. But if you take a look at this, you will notice something, that the height of the frame inside of the desktop is longer than the height of the main desktop. So to fix this, you select the desktop, go over to the resizing option and change the height from fixed to fit content. Then it's going to fit whatever height of the frame inside of it. So let's just assume that we have a height of 500 pieces right here. So this is 500 and hit enter. You'll notice that the height of the main desktop is responsive to the height of the frame inside of it. So I'm just going to return this back to 4000. I'll be renaming this as main section. Of course, we won't be making use of the fill color. I'll be doing away with that. That's it for this section. So there again, we have to think about adding individual sections inside of this main section. What do I mean? So if you go back to the main design I did right here, you see that the whole animation lies on the hero section. So the section I'm going to bring out inside of the tutorial page of the main section is going to be the hero section. So F on your keyboard again, drag out a frame, and I'll be making the width of it to fill width. And for the height, ordinarily the height of this present frame is okay to roll as a hero section, but based on the screw animation we are trying to achieve, we have to choose a higher height as the hero section. So I'm just going to set 3000 as a height here and hit enter. You know the drill, so I'm going to turn this into a layout, change the gap to 0 and change the distribute to start. Then the last thing is to turn off the color. I'll be renaming this tag that we just added as hero section. After creating the hero section, we're actually making progress, but we have to step up this momentum to the next level. So for the second section I'm going to add inside of it is actually a sticky section, because if you take a look at the main one that I did right here, when we are trying to make a screw, it's more like the images are at a fixed position on the hue section. It only gets activated when we actually scroll through the section. So we are going to be bringing out, go back to our tutorial page, we are going to be bringing out a sticky section inside of the hue section. So F on your keyboard again, drag out a frame. I will setting this to width fill. Then as for the height, I'm not going to set it to whatever length. I'm just going to turn this into viewport. And you might be wondering, what is this 100% VH that I set right here? Why didn't I use maybe a fill or fixed or relative or any of those resizing option? So the reason why I choose the viewport is this. I want it to be that whatever device I'm viewing the animation from, the animation should cover 100% of the given screen. So if I'm doing this design or recording this tutorial from a desktop, a larger desktop, it means that the hero section or the sticky section is going to cover 100% of my screen, just like how you're seeing it right here. So all the animation, instead of it to maybe fall into another section, I want it to be that whatever design I'm viewing should cover 100% of the given screen sizes. Same thing applies for a mobile device. If I also view this from a mobile device, it means that it's going to cover 100% of the given screen size of that mobile device. I hope this explanation helps. That's just the best way I can explain this stuff. So I'll be turning this into a stack as usual, then change the distribute to start. But on the second thought, the images right here are actually on the center part of the sticky section. So I'm just going to swipe that back from start to center. Then for the gap, I'll take this down to 0. You know, the next thing to do is to remove the fill color because obviously we're not making use of it. For the layers panel, I'll be renaming this as sticky section. So after renaming it as a sticky section and changing the height from fixed to viewport, it doesn't automatically become a sticky section. There are still some steps we have to, take to turn this section into a sticky section. So I'm going to select this, go over to the properties and change it from relative, not to absolute, but to sticky, which is the last option here. Now, nothing might have changed, but let me show you the difference between what it looks like now we have turned it into a sticky position. F on my keyboard, drag a small frame inside of it like this. When previewing this, you will notice something, that the frame that we just brought out is in one position, because you can see that we're actually making a scroll. So it only scrolls away when the height of the hue section has been exhausted, which is at 3000 that we set on the hue section. So the frame inside of a sticky section remains stagnant while we are making a scroll. So this alone gives us the illusion of, we can use this to create the animation that we want. So let's head back. But in case if you don't understand this, let me just explain it in this way. I'll be bringing out a frame outside of the section just like this, and I'm changing it to fill. So this frame that we just brought out right now is outside of the sticky section, and by previewing this, you will notice something. Since it's not in a sticky position, it just screws away like a normal frame, but the frame inside of the section that we turned into a sticky section remains stagnant upon scrolling. So that's just how sticky position works. I'm going to be removing the frame obviously because this is not what we are up for. I just brought in the images we are going to be using to create this interaction. So for us to place these images inside of the sticky section, we have to bring out a frame that will wrap the images, because I don't want everything to be scattered inside of the sticky section. So F on my keyboard, drag out a frame, and I'll be setting this to fill and also fill as a height. I'll be turning this into a stack because, like I said before, now we are going to be using stack a lot in this animation. So I'm just turning this down to 0. So what else? I'll be removing the fill color because we are not going to be making use of it. So the next thing to do right here is to import the images and start making sure they're in this 3D environment. So like the one I did right here on the main design. But before we go through this process of placing the images, we have to really have a clear understanding of how 3D works in Filma. Because I might just show you how it works right now, but when you meet a greater obstacle, you will obviously get confused just because you don't know the basis of how 3D works in Filma. I'll just use this example to explain everything. I'll be dragging in this image inside of, let me just rename this as 3D space just rename it to image 3D space. So for us to place this image right here in a 3D space, the first thing we have to do is to select it, and we are going to be adding a transform to it. So this is on the properties menu. Click the plus. We have so many types of transform. We have the scale, we have the screw, we have the rotate, depth, perspective, origin, blackface, backface. That's the first time I'm actually seeing something like this. And we also have the preserve 3D. So I don't really make use of all the settings here. I just pick the one that is most important for me to create a 3D interaction. I'll be choosing rotation here, or rotate. We have two aspects of this rotate, which is the 2D aspect and the 3D aspect. So the 2D aspect controls just basic tilting from front to left, left to right. Then for the 3D, which is what we are most concerned in, gives us that perfect 3D space that we want. So you have your x-axis, you have your y-axis, you have your z-axis. So the y-axis creates this depth on the image, while your x-axis, which is right here, I think it just pushes the images from the top to the bottom, top to the bottom. Then for the last one, which is the z-axis, it does basically what this 2D aspect does. That's just the z-axis. But for this particular animation, what we are going to be utilizing more is the y and the x-axis. So I'm just going to turn this to 0 right here. Turn this to 0. And let's just increase and create this depth on this image. So let's just say 58. Taking a closer look at this image, it's taking this 3D shape, but the image is still looking kind of flat. It's still looking kind of distorted. It's not really taking that 3D space that I'm visioning right from my head. So for us to fix this, there are a series of steps we have to take. So the first thing we are going to do is to apply perspective. Then one other magic source I'm going to be applying later. So I'll be selecting the overall frame, going over to the transform. I'll be setting a perspective to this, but it doesn't just end there. Talking about the switch source that we are going to be applying right now to make sure everything is finalized and automatically turned into a 3D space is to make sure we add this last two, which is preserve 3D. I'm not really going to explain what preserve 3D means, simply because preserve 3D simply is preserve 3D. So you just make sure that everything inside of the section takes this perfect 3D aspect. So I'm just going to be selecting preserve 3D and close your eye for the magic. Voila! So it gives the perfect 3D aspect that I'm envisioning. Because without you knowing this steps, you might just rotate 3D and you feel that is how 3D works. Nope. So we have to add perspective to the overall frame and also add a preserve 3D that will make everything inside of that section take that 3D format or 3D scene. So for the perspective of this, the higher the figure right here, the more flatter the image becomes. So this is what it was looking like before, but by setting a lower value on the perspective, it's setting that perfect, more in-depth part of the image. So going back to the image, we can now play with our y-axis, which gives a perfect 360 rotation of our image. So this is just how, let me zoom out. So this is just how 3D works in Framer. Is just that simple. So with this understanding, we can now have a perfect idea of what to do with these images right here. So I'll select everything, Ctrl X, then paste it inside of the image 3D frame. For the images, I'm going to be selecting everything right here, then wrap them in another stack. So I have reasons for this. The image 3D space is actually the overall frame that is controlling everything about 3D. So it's best for us to wrap the images in its own section stack. So select everything using the shortcut Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter. We have created another section for the images. I'll be renaming this as image wrap. Then for the image wrap section, I'll be removing the gap. Then for the width, it's going to be fit content, so you can fit the content of all the images inside of it. So what next? So the next thing to do right here is to apply 3D to the images, just like I showed you a while ago before we started adding all these images. So I'm going to select all the images inside of the image wrap, go over to the transform, and I'm going to choose rotate 3D, and let's do this a bit. Let's just put this to 90 degree. I'll also do the same for the image wrap. Go over to the transform, add a rotate 3D, and I'm going to rotate it to same 90 degree and hit enter. But you will notice one thing, that we can't see our images, we can't see them in a 3D space. Before now, when we are dealing with that just one image, when we turned it into that rotate 3D and we apply perspective and preserve 3D to the overall frame, we're able to see that image play in 3D space. But now, when we apply the rotate on the images and also applied it to the overall frame or to the overall stack wrapping the images, our images are nowhere to be found. So let's think about how we can solve this. Taking a look at the image 3D space, you can see that the transform we added here was the perspective and preserve 3D. And for us to make anything in a 3D space, this stuff here, this perspective and preserve 3D, has to be applied to the parent frame. Since we brought up another subsection stack, which is the image wrap, we have to apply same thing right here. So go over to the transform, and I'm going to choose perspective, and I'm going to choose preserve 3D. And voila, our images are showing, but I think we're in a more deeper trouble, because the image is kind of enlarged. I didn't experience something like this when I was doing mine. So we have to find out how we can, fix this whole stuff. First of all, where is this blue canvas coming from? Because I can't place why I didn't apply any blue fill on the image wrap. So where is this issue coming from? So let me think. So taking a look at the perspective on the overall image 3D space, so we added the perspective of 1000, and when we increase it, remember when I said when we choose a higher value, it makes it less 3D. So by changing the perspective to like 5000, it reduces the size down to how we want it to be. But taking a look at the image wrap, I think we still have a problem somewhere, which is kind of undetectable. So I just remembered something. I made a very big mistake. Not really a very big mistake, a very tiny mistake. So talking about the perspective, for us to take things in a 3D space, we have to apply perspective. Now this perspective that we added is supposed to be on the overall section that is wrapping everything else. So the perspective being on two sections, one here and one on the image wrap, is kind of too much. So I think that was the reason why our image was kind of enlarged at first. So I'm going to be removing one of the perspective from the image wrap. So I click remove the perspective, then going over to the overall image 3D, I'm going to put this down because I want it to be more 3D than less 3D. So for us to make it a more 3D like, we have to set a lower value. So I'm going to set 1000 pieces here, and we are good to roll. With this, going over to the image wrap, we can now play with our Y value to see if everything is in a 3D aspect, which it is. So everything now, it's in a 3D space. We are making a whole lot of progress because this is exactly what we are saying here. I think something like this, then I think this. So going over to the main design I did right here, you can see we are replicating almost the same thing right here. So the next thing we have to start watching out for is how to animate these whole images here to scale in when we are making a scroll, because previewing this, the stuff that we are doing here, you can see it's still in that sticky part. Nothing is animating in when we are making a scroll. So selecting this, selecting the image wrap, the stuff we are going to be using to animate this whole thing, it's a scroll transform. So going over to the effect, going over to scroll, then scroll transform. So what we are more concerned in here is the two state, what happens after when we are making a scroll. That's just how two state is. So for us to make this animate in, we're actually going to use this offset, which is the X and Y value. But something strange is happening here. Play with the X value, you will notice something, that instead of it to animate, or instead of it to scale in backward or forward or backward, it's scaling from right to left or from left to right, which is not what we want. We don't want to create a scroll effect where the images are scrolling from the right or to the left hand side. And if you are thinking what I'm thinking, to play with the Y value, this is a product of the Y value. It's not really creating that forward or backward animation. So what we're going to do, because what we really need from this scroll transform is to create this illusion that the images are kind of scrolling in and tilting kind of when we are making a scroll. So how do we solve this? So I have two solutions actually. There's actually a thing called depth we can use to create this scaling in and forward and backward movement of our images. But one thing about using depth is that it doesn't work along with scroll transform. What do I mean? So when I select scroll and scroll transform to the to state, selecting the X value, you'll see it's still taking that from the left to the right animation type. So it's only creating the depth on the transform angle, but it's not really creating that forward and backward movement when we select this scroll transform effect. And for us to create this whole animation, there's no way we can maneuver scroll transform. So that's why depth can never ever work in this case. So I'm just going to remove this. Right click and remove. So what's the last option that we have here to create this interaction? So it's a weird option that takes wrapping this image wrap in another stack. So selecting the image wrap, use the shortcut Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter to create an overall stack wrapping the image wrap that is wrapping the images inside of the image wrap. So that's a lot of explanation. So with this, there's actually a way we can maneuver to create that kind of interaction that we are looking for. So I'll first select this and rename it to, let's just rename it to 3D rotate. For the width of it, I'm going to change it to fit content. Then if you could remember, to create a 3D environment, we have to preserve the 3D. So going over to the transform, preserve 3D, and voila. So the next thing we're going to be doing here is to bring out a rotate 3D. So go over to the rotate 3D and I'll be turning this y-axis to 90 degree. So I think there's a problem somewhere from the image wrap on the x-axis. So yep, we have -9 here. Just change this to 0. For the y-axis of the image wrap, I'm going to retain this as same 90 that we set on the 3D rotate. So doing just this simple thing, do you believe if I tell you right now that that issue has been solved? Because if we were to go back to the effect screw transform to the to state, going over to the offset, the x-axis, you can now see it's giving this forward and backward movement that we want. So with this, we can now use it to create that interaction that we are looking for. So the fun fact about this is that after making sure that we have tilted this in an angle of 90 degree and also tilted this in an angle of 90 degree, we can actually turn the image wrap back to the position it was, which should be around 180 degree. Yep. Then to tilt the images down a little bit, I think we can do that from the 3D rotate on the x-axis. So something like this. Sorry. So -12, I think we should just leave it at 11. So this is good to roll. So previewing this on the scroll transform, going over to the x-axis, raising this value up and down, you can now see it's creating, we are getting close to the animation that we want. We're making a whole lot of progress. The next thing we are going to be looking out for is how to apply animations to what we have done. The first animation we are going to be applying is to make all the images scale in when we are making a scroll. So that means we are going to be applying this animation on the image wrap section that is wrapping the 4 images that we have within it. So go over to the effect. We are going to be using the same scroll transform we're using to experiment things before now. From the from state, it's going to be opacity 1, scale 1, then the to state, we are going to be raising the x value of the offset. So something in the negative aspect until we see the last image. So something like this. So let's just put it to -1000. Going back to the image wrap on the scroll transform, we are going to be applying this transition. This spring effect or spring transition is okay to roll with this animation. But for the trigger, it's not going to be on scroll, it's not going to be layer in view, but it's going to be section in view. So why are we going to use section in view? Because I thought I was saying before now that we are going to use on scroll. But to animate things individually on these images, we have to use section in view. So by setting section in view, it will allow us to add trigger frames that when they come in contact with this particular image, the animation that we place on them begins to animate. So let me recap everything I just said. The reason why I'm going to choose section in view is this. We'll be setting a trigger frame that whenever it comes in contact or in section with the image that we are trying to animate, the animation begins to play out individually. So we can set a trigger frame on the first image, set a trigger frame on the second image, set a trigger frame on the third and the fourth image. So whenever these trigger frames come in section with the sticky section, the animation we place on them begins to play out. So I'm just going to set trigger section in view, For the section, since there's no section, we are going to be creating a trigger section. Then we'll come back here to link it. So just cancel this. F on my keyboard, drag out a frame outside of the sticky section. So outside of the sticky section, we're going to be applying this frame. So I'll be setting the width right here to fill. For the height, let's just choose something like 2200 because the overall height of the hero section is 3000. So I just don't want it to, fill everything else. I will then rename this as trigger frame. And we'll make a copy of this, Ctrl C. We will turn this into a layout, a stack obviously. Then for the gap, I'm going to turn this to 0. Then for the distribute, I will change this to start. Going down here, after the transform, we have our screw section. So we're going to turn this trigger frame into a screw section and Ctrl+V. We are setting it literally as the same name that we named it on the layers panel. So let's go back to that image wrap section. So I think it's somewhere around here. Okay, so this is it, image wrap. And on the transform, the screw transform, we are going to be selecting this section and click this trigger frame we just created. So by previewing this, you will notice something that immediately we are scrolling to the point of seeing this trigger frame that we set right here, the animation that we place on the image wrap begins to play out. So we're getting close to the animation that we are trying to create because at this point, the images are beginning to scale in like how we want them to be. But if you take a look at the main one here, the animation plays individually based on the images. So they don't move together while we're making a scroll. They move individually. So we're going to be making an interaction to make the first image tilt a little bit because taking a look at this one on the home page here, you notice that when the image is kind of scaling into section, it's creating this tilt effect, more like it's bending. I don't know how to explain it, but you're seeing what I'm saying right now, that the image is kind of tilting downwards when coming inwards. So we're going to be doing that right away. But I'm noticing something when we are making a screw on this level, that when it gets to the end of our trigger frame, the last image is still kind of animating, like it's just cutting off at this level here. So it's supposed to end at when the trigger frame, this blue frame, ends, but it's still kind of animating even when the trigger frame has ended at this point. So let's try to fix this issue. So go back to the trigger frame, back to the main section, hero section, trigger frame. So I think to solve this, we have to change it from fixed to fill. So you can fill the hero section, that's the 3000 that we set on the hero section. So let's preview this once more to see if that has fixed itself. And yep, so by scrolling up to this point, you see that the animation on the last image ends at where the trigger frame ends. So if you are thinking about the color of this trigger frame, it's going to be invisible in the sense that we can turn the color off because we don't want that blue color to show on our design. So it's more like an invisible trigger that we use to activate animations on a particular level. So on this trigger frame, we can just decide to remove the fill color. You notice that the animation still stands even when we have, removed the fill color of the animation. So I'm just going to be bringing back the fill color so it doesn't just get you confused when we start adding other trigger frames. Now we have added a trigger frame on the overall image wrap section. We have to start placing screw transform on the individual images that we have here. So what do I mean? So I'll select the first image here, go over to the effect, go over to screw transform. From the from state, it's going to be opacity 1, scale 1. Then from the to state, we are going to create that tilt effect to make the image kind of bend in when making the image come inward. So to do that, we are going to go over to the rotation aspect, to the 3D aspect. So I think the Z-axis controls that. So this is something, let me zoom in out to this section. So this looking more like it. So by previewing the home page, you'll notice that this tilt effect that is happening on this image, it's only happening on this level. That is, it's not really happening from the top section, it's animating from the center of the image. So let me play this again in case if you don't understand what I'm trying to say. The rotation effect on the Z-axis is only appearing or is only animating from the center of the card or the center of the image. It's not affecting the top of the image. It's only animating from the center, half the image. So this is it, because we still have this straight line, but what is really animating on the Z-axis is just coming from the center of the image. And if you take a look at the one we are doing right here on the screw transform, going to the to state, you'll notice that the whole image is, rotating together on the Z-axis. But what we want is to make the rotation of this Z-axis in the 3D space come from the center of the image without it affecting the top of the image. So the only way we can fix that is to go over to transform, go over to origin. So on the origin, we have two values here, the X value and the Y value. So the X value controls from this point to this point. Then for the Y value controls from this point to the center of the image. So since we don't want the whole animation affecting the X value, we are going to be turning the Y value to 0%. So I know this might get you confused, but just follow the process of how I did this. So going back to the screw transform to the to state, then you'll notice something that when we're trying to play with the Z value, you'll see that the rotation is not affecting the top section of the image. This is exactly what I actually wanted to achieve. So I'm just going to tilt this, and for the offset, we're just going to be placing it something at this point. So let's just set it up a bit. So something like this is okay to roll. We're going to go back and add a transition to it, a spring transition. And as usual, for the trigger, it's not going to be on scroll, but section in view, because we're going to be creating a trigger frame later on. We can't use this trigger frame we created just because this trigger frame has its own function on the overall image wrap. So inside of the trigger frame here, we are going to be creating a frame inside of it. So F, just drag out something like this. We're going to be changing it to width fill here, and for the height is going to be viewport. So for the 100%, I'm going to be reducing this to 50%. So this controls the duration of how I want this animation to play out. The reason why I now have to slash it to 50% VH is because there are other images behind it that has to animate. The next thing we are going to be doing is to change the color to create a slight difference, so you can actually see the whole animation play out in real time. So I'm just going to change it to a darker version of the blue. I'll rename this as trigger 1, and I'll copy this, Ctrl C. Firstly, I'll turn this into a layout. Then for the gap, it's going to be 0. Then you move down to the screw section, click the plus, Ctrl and V to select the trigger 1. You revert back to the image, go over to the screw transform. Then for the section in view, we are going to be placing this trigger 1. So by previewing this, when the trigger frame 1 begins to appear in the sticky section, the animation that we place on the image, the first image, begins to play out. So it's just this easy. So with this understanding of setting a trigger frame and section in view, we are going to be applying it on other images, on the 3 left images that we have behind it. So to apply this trigger effect and screw transform to the remaining images that we have behind the first one, we have to duplicate the triggers that we place here. So I'm going to rename this as trigger 2, copy it and correct it on the screw section. So I'm just going to put this at trigger 2, then make another duplicate, Ctrl D, and put this to correct it to trigger 3. Correct that on also on the screw section, trigger 3. And I think we also have one more to go. So Ctrl D and set this to trigger 4 and correct it also on the screw section to trigger 4. After doing this, we are going to be changing the individual colors so it doesn't get you confused, so you can actually understand how these dots work. So I'm going to change this to a darker version and change this maybe to a lighter version, and maybe change this one to something like this. For the animation we added on this first image, we are going to place it on the remaining images behind it. So instead of starting from scratch in creating a scroll trigger section in view, we can actually copy the effect. So just right click and hit copy, then select the second image behind it, go back to the effect, right click and paste effect. Then the only thing we're going to be switching here is the trigger. So for this trigger, it's going to be trigger 2, and I'm going to do the same for this one. Right click, paste effect, go back to the trigger, and it's going to be trigger 3. Then for this last one, I'm going to change it from this trigger 1 to the last trigger, which is trigger 4. So this should better work because we have wasted a lot of time in trying to define all these kind of triggers. So for the first trigger, it's working perfectly, and when the second trigger comes into section, it activates the second trigger on the second image. Then when the third image trigger comes, which is a lighter version, it begins to play out the animation we added on the third image. Then for the last one, which is a darker version of the trigger, it begins to animate in. But I have one issue with this. For the last image here, it's not really giving, because when we are making a scroll on this, we can actually see a space between these images. But when it comes to the last part, we can't find any gap between this last image and the third image. So how do we go about this? So if you could remember when I said this trigger determines the duration that we want on these particular images. So we are going to increase, I just hope this works. So we are going to increase the trigger of this last section. Nope. So we're going to increase the trigger of the third image before the last image. So selecting the third trigger, we're going to, let's try to add more VH to see if it's going to fix that gapping stuff. So I'm going to say like 70% VH here. So we're making a scroll, and when it gets to this section, okay, there's a little gap actually. It's just a tiny gap, meaning that we have to increase the VH maybe to like 80 or 100%. So I think that's the only way we can solve this issue, because before now, when we're seeing this tiny gap at this point, so I'm just going to change this. Let's just hope this works. Change this to 100% here. So I think this problem has been fixed because we have enough space to separate the third and the last image. So I think, yeah, we have actually solved this problem, because when I was doing the first one, I didn't really encounter something like this. So I think we are done with this animation because everything is playing out so smooth, like so smooth. So the last thing we are going to be doing now is to hide the colors of this trigger. So I'll select the first one and remove the fill color, then select the second one, remove the fill color right here, third, remove the fill, where is it? Somewhere around here, remove. And for the last trigger, voila. So by previewing this, you can now see how easy it is to create this interaction in Framer. So someone that has not watched this tutorial will think that we just animated our way through these images. The person might not really know the hidden secrets or the triggers behind this images frame. So if you like videos that explain things down to the basics, I think this channel has found you, or I found you, or you found me, something like that, I don't know. But hit that subscribe button to see more of these videos like this. And in no time, trust me, you become a Framer superhero.